Hello, friends, and welcome to Week 3, Lecture 1. We turn now to political culture and socialization. Political culture and socialization are central to understanding how a particular country views its political system, how it tends to support or not support its political system, and how it, at a much deeper level, understands that political system. For example, if we were to use our own country, the United States, there are certain assumptions about our political culture that most Americans would share. Not completely, but to give you some idea. For example, President Richard Milhouse Nixon, who was president from 1969 to 1974. When you invoke his name, many people will say, well, oh, Nixon was a crook. That's what dictated how he behaved and how he made decisions. So it was a period of somewhat political darkness, of failure of political success. And our, another president from the fairly recent political history, President Jimmy Carter, who was president from 1977 to January of 1981. Most people, when you invoke Carter's name, will say, well, he was a fairly ineffective president, obsessed with details, not able to see the big picture, a nice moral person, but unable to carry out the role of the president. 21st century, for example, if somebody were to begin a discussion of the United States Congress, the House and Senate, they would discuss, or many people would have the view, well, Congress is ineffective. It doesn't get a lot done. It's the president who's the real mover, the shaker of the Supreme Court. This, of course, has not been true for the majority of American political history, but it is one of the ways that we tend to think about our political system. Um, Most people uh, don't know parts of our political system, which is part of our political culture. For example, the Supreme Court, we have 9 justices. If you ask the average American, they might know one justice, or more likely are not to know uh, the majority of justices. In fact, the average American is more likely to know the names of the Three Stooges, the comedy team, than they are to know the name of 3 Supreme Court justices. So that gives you some idea. We tend not to know much about our judicial system. We tend to uh, receive our news from many other sources besides the direct news agencies. A lot of people watch The Late Show with Stephen Colbert or some other show, and that's where they learn about much of what's happening in the country. So it's kind of a different source with its own focus that sometimes maybe not altogether newsworthy. Um, but on the other hand, most Americans, when you ask them about their political system, they think we have the best political system on the earth and that it should be the one that other countries should model, even though themselves may say very negative things about the American political system. So that leads us to a discussion of political culture. And political culture is the patterns or beliefs, and above all, the attitudes that Americans have regarding respect, society, and politics. The same holds true about political culture more generally when we come to comparative politics. That it's the attitudes that citizens of a country have, their beliefs in respect to authority, society, and politics. So political culture is really how citizens think about politics and think about government. Political culture also includes how they think about the formal rules of politics in the country, politics and government, as well as the unwritten rules. Sometimes the unwritten rules can be as important as the written rules. Um, when we speak in generalities and speak of the American political tradition, and we were to ask Americans what Americans usually say in terms of our political culture, whether what they usually affirm are, is that they're not very interested in government. Government is not their be all of their existence. The average American is more interested in his or her own employment, their own church, their own community service organizations, their favorite athletic teams than they are uh, political organizations. This is not the case in other democracies, including in Western Europe, where one's political party kind of defines who a person is and what's most important to them and what guides and animates their life. Um, Voter turnout, not surprisingly in America, is in decline and lower than in many of the Western democracies of the world. Um, Most Americans believe their government is relatively inefficient and ineffective. Uh, Whether that's true or not, in many cases, it's definitely not true. This also goes along with the culture where the citizen is more critical of government than they are in other countries as well. We also tend to view, on the other hand, uh, market economics, free market economics, uh, free enterprise as what guides our country, what helps produce the wealth that we have, without much criticism of the corporations who gain tremendous power and influence in that system. So, which we tend, when that's separated out as a separate question in polling and in surveys, we do tend to view more negatively. Americans tend to be in favor of equality of opportunity rather than state forced quality measures. For example, many Americans are critical of affirmative action, preferential based hiring, but they still want the hiring process to be fair. So um, most Americans tend to favor uh, individual responsibility over state sponsored rules and obligations. So these are some aspects of the American political culture. Um, the values that Americans hold foremost are really threefold. Number one, freedom. Uh, we have the right to live our lives, or we want the right to live our lives the way we choose, not from, and that government should not have total control of that. Tolerance, that we should be able to live out our lives the way we want to, um, and have a certain openness of allowing others to live out their lives as well. And thirdly, trust. Americans trust one another for the most part that we can achieve a common goal. Um, there is a high degree, and certainly in politics and society, of a lot of cooperation. A couple recent studies that identify and begin to, in some ways, also challenge these ideas of American political culture. And again, we're studying this as we relate it to a more international setting. A recent work by Robert Putnam, a political scientist at Harvard, called Bowling Alone. I once encountered Dr. Putnam at an American political science meeting and had a chance to briefly discuss this book with him. And I hope I didn't embarrass myself too much. But um, he talked about some of the aspects of American political culture. For example, uh, we know that Americans like to join organizations, perhaps more when you exclude political parties, more than any other the citizens of any other democracy, and that uh, the more organizations a person is part of, the more higher level of trust they have about politics, about their friends, about their regions, about their organizations. So there's a gained political capital. Uh, what Putnam argues in his book Bowling Alone, as the title suggests, is Americans are increasingly less likely to join those kinds of organizations. And as Americans become less likely to join those organizations, there are some challenges that a country will face. Um, and so the idea of bowling alone, if a person would rather be alone than joining other groups, joining friends. And this trend is increasing. Um, and many things in our society, many aspects encourage that kind of removal from the older social organizations, the old high level of interaction that was so much part of American democracy. For example, sometimes individuals will just depend on technology for their entertainment. They'll stream a movie, spend time corresponding electronically, or just use some other means besides direct interaction. And Putnam believes that this is negative and long term will affect American democracy, American politics in a negative way. That level of cooperation, the openness, tolerance we talked about earlier, that it will have an effect on those kinds of key concepts that have been so much a part of American life. Another book entitled Millennials Rising by Howard Strauss claim that those in college 10 or 15 years ago, as well as those in college today, um, are face challenges that again may affect that long-standing political culture and how it functions. That um, there's more of a pressure to succeed on one hand, but also there's a greater protection that these millennials, and of course we have new terms for those who've come after millennials as well, that new struggles that uh, are being must be faced, and that the pressure from parents, the overprotection of parents and support networks doesn't allow folks to sort of seek out and make new friends or participate in political society and do other things that they were allowed to do before. Um, another criticism that deserves consideration outside of Howell and Strauss and Robert Putnam is that in what some political scientists view as an increasing authoritarian political structure, that people begin to accept the controls that are being offered and may value stability and order over their chance to advance individually, whatever that might be. Which leads us to the notion of political socialization. As political socialization means how we come to know about politics, how we come to know about government, and how politics and government work, and what our role in relationship to politics and government might be. So that's what we mean by political socialization. What are the sources of political socialization? Um, and again, this is in an American context, but it also uh, is more general, as political scientists will argue. These ideas form the basis of all political socialization. The number one factor, as you might imagine, in political socialization is the family. It is the most important source of political socialization. We know from half a century of very good social science research that children, the majority of American children, when they become citizens, will join the same political party as their parents. Now that is decreasing in the 21st century, but that has been the trend and continues to be the trend. So if both of your parents are Republican, the odds are, it doesn't predict it, but you're more likely to be a Republican uh, as well than a Democrat. The same way, if your parents are Democratic, members of the Democratic Party, you will tend to also join the Democratic Party. That's not always the case. What we do know is that while you may be a member of that party, your actual party preferences, what you might support or believe is important, will change over time. Second factor in political socialization is education. To be as succinct as one can be, the longer you stay in school, the more liberal your political ideas will be. And by liberal, we mean more likely to see the government as the source of all solutions. Uh, the government as being more of a positive force in society and politics. Third source, peer groups. We tend to be influenced by the people we're around. Um, uh, Especially in our formative years, our teenage years, our young adult years. We tend to be shaped by what others view as important, compare those with our own values and our own mores, and it's usually our peers that introduce us to a broader realm of ideas. Another factor in political socialization is the media. Media is very important. That's where we get the news. That's where we get information about what's happening in the world. Um, in a society like America, where we have relative freedom of expression, it is the media who gives us many of those ideas about how uh, we should be confronting political and social issues that are before the country. Also, political scientists usually talk about these areas that we have just covered as primary areas of political socialization. There are secondary areas of political socialization that cannot be neglected, and for some people become primary areas of political socialization. What are some examples of these factors? what kind of work you're in. If you happen to be in a union, that union, whether it be the Communications Workers of America or the Auto Workers, United Auto Workers, you'll tend to favor whatever policies, whatever government decisions that benefit those agencies. Even if you might be a Republican and sort of anti-union in terms of many of your political views, if you're a member of the United Auto Workers, you're going to favor government policies typically, and this is not exhaustively, but more generally, uh, policies that will benefit union workers. Religious groups, one's faith orientation has a tremendous impact on how they view politics. Typically, religion does not dictate how we vote. It simply helps us form a view of human nature that then dictates how we should act politically, what our role and view of the government should be. There are many more of these that we could study if this were a class in public opinion, um, but we have to move on. But this gives you some ideas. One way of putting this all together in terms of comparative politics is to realize that all countries have a dominant political culture. They tend to be very, very different, but they do tend to be a collection of attitudes about uh, the political system itself. Not everyone in that system may have the same political culture. It may be a political culture of the elite ruling class in the country, where the majority of the country may have other views. Um, and so countries can vary accordingly. Some of the great studies of political culture, uh, certainly in a historical vein, that are worth you examining and considering. Probably one of the most famous, certainly in relationship to America, is Alexis de Tocqueville, the French aristocrat who came to the United States in the 1830s and took a tour really from the Mississippi area up to really New England, New York and New England. Didn't spend a lot of time in the South, which is a critical, in my mind, a critical problem with his great work, Democracy in America. But it's still, Democracy in America is still a very, very important work. He saw Americans as joiners, people joining groups, engaging in the democratic enterprise, engaging in democratic politics. He also, when he interviewed Americans, said they had a great love of liberty, and liberty here meaning the protection from coercion. They had the right to make our own decisions. No one else were making those decisions for us. Another great study of political culture is Max Weber's The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, 20th century study, early 20th century. And he believed that political and economic freedom went together, and that the wealth producing of a free market economy in the Western world with free economic institutions brought about political liberty. And he said really that Protestantism, and that's within Christianity. You have Catholicism, and you have the original form of Christianity, and the Protestant Protestantism, which came as a result of the Protestant Reformation. That Protestantism stressed that political and economic liberty going together. A more recent study by two famous American political scientists, Allman and Verba, as a civic culture, said we had to look at political socialization through the three separate lenses. Right? These three separate lenses were the participants, the people who really know about politics, people who are engaged, what their views were, what kind of political activity they support. Second grouping within the Allman and Verba, the civic culture critique, was the subjects. That they tended to be less aware of what was going on in the country. These are the people who were not as engaged in politics. They did not participate at a very active level. They didn't see politics as benefiting them, unlike the participant level, who saw them as being very uh, benefiting tremendously from being involved in politics. They also looked at a third level of citizen participation, citizen knowledge, called the parochial level. And these are people who know basically nothing about politics. They don't really have anything to do with the government, and didn't see government as helping them. And so they're essentially disengaged. One might call it, to use a technical political science term, they're out to lunch. We find this in many areas of the developing world where there are large groups uh, that are not part of the government at all. They sort of do their own thing. And when you're trying to build a country, try to carry out, administer government programs, you try to even sometimes protect the country's borders, sometimes these groups can be a major challenge. A good example in the 21st century would be a country like Pakistan, where you have a fairly sophisticated political regime with lots of authority and a capital and regions under great control. But then you have areas um, in the north, Pakistan, that are really sort of no person's land. These kinds of parochial groups are in charge. They exhibit great political authority, and so very hard to bring in uh, as part of a coherent political regime. Uh, Alman and Verba think all three of these elements of political culture and political society exist, and what they argue is the country's really most likely to survive and to be stable if there is a civic culture, if there is a political culture that is vibrant and is shared. So, um, while that is not the case in most countries, it gives us a model, it gives us an idea of what we're talking about with this concept of political socialization. Well, there's some background items, some background studies that kind of form us as we continue to look at this idea of political culture and refine it and look at some more practical applications. Thank you.